Greetings, everybody. Gleekon here again with another episode of Lore of Warcraft. On our last episode, we saw Thrall escape from Durnhold Keep, something that you can do in some version as an instance in the Caverns of Time. Although it's not quite in the... So I'm wondering if some of the events that we're about to read in the next chapter or maybe later in this book are going to reflect that, because in the instance, you are Thrall coming back and you're trying to rescue Taratha, but then again, you also do go in and unlock him from a cage. Yeah, so it's a little different. All right, so stay a while and listen to this, which is chapter 7 of Lord of the Clans. Thrall knew that Taratha had pointed out where the internment camps were located specifically so that he could avoid them. She wanted him to try to find free orcs, but he was uncertain as to whether these free orcs were even still alive or merely figments of some wistful warrior's imagination. He had studied maps while under Jaramin's tutelage, so he knew how to read the one Tari had given him, and he set a course straight for one of the camps. He did not choose the one nearest Durnhold. There was a good chance that once he was missed, Blackmore would have issued an alert. There was one that, according to the map, was located several leagues away from the fortress where Thrall had reached maturity. This was the one he would visit. He knew only a little about the camps, and that little was filtered through the minds of his men who hated his people. As he jogged easily and tirelessly toward his destination, his mind raced. What would it be like to see so many orcs all in one place? Would they be able to understand his speech? Or would it be so tainted with a human accent he would be unable to converse at even the most basic level? Would they challenge him? He did not wish to fight them, but everything he knew told him that orcs were fierce, proud, unstoppable warriors. He was a trained fighter, but would that be enough against one of these legendary beings? Would he be able to hold his own long enough to persuade them that he was not their enemy? Miles fell beneath his feet. From time to time he looked at the stars to judge his position. He had never been taught how to navigate, but one of the secret books Dari had given him had dealt with the stars and their positions. Thrall had studied it eagerly, absorbing every scrap of information that had come his way. Maybe he would meet the clan who bore the emblem of the white wolf head against the blue background. Maybe he would find his family. Blackmore had told him he had been found not terribly far from Durnhold, so Thrall thought it quite possible that he would encounter members of his clan. Excitement flooded him. It was good. He traveled all that night and halted to rest once the sun began to rise. If he knew Blackmore, and he did, the Lieutenant General would have men out looking for him. Perhaps they would even press him to use one of their famed flying machines. Thrall had never seen one and had privately doubted their existence, but if they did indeed exist, then Blackmore would commandeer the use of one to find his wandering champion. He thought of Tari and desperately hoped that her part in his escape had not been discovered. Blackmore did not think he had ever been angrier in his entire life, and that was saying a great deal. He had been roused from his slumber, alone tonight, Taratha had pleaded illness, by the clamor of the bells, and stared in horror out his window at the billowing orange flames across the courtyard. Throwing on clothing, he had raced to join the rest of Durnhold's populace as they frantically tried to contain the blaze. It had taken several hours, but by the time dawn's pink hue had begun to taint the night sky, the inferno had been tamed to a pile of sullen embers. "It's a miracle no one was hurt," said Langston, wiping his forehead. His pale face was tinted black by the soot. Blackmore fancied he looked no better. Everyone present was soiled and sweaty. The servants would have quite a bit of washing to do tomorrow. "Not even the animals," said Tamas, coming up to them. "There was no way the animals could escape on their own. We can't be certain, my lord, but it's beginning to look as though this fire was deliberately set." "By the light," gasped Langston. "Do you really think so? Who would want to do such a thing?" "I count all my enemies on my hands except I'd run out of fingers," growled Blackmore. "And toes. Plenty of bastards out there jealous of my rank and my Lothar's ghost." He suddenly felt cold and imagined that his face was white beneath the soot. Langston and Tamith both stared at him. He couldn't spare the time to voice his concern. He leaped up from the stone steps upon which he had been sitting and sped back toward the fortress. Both friend and servant followed him, crying out, "Blackmore, wait!" and "My lord, what is it?" Blackmore ignored them. He hastened down the corridors, up the stairs, and skidded to a halt in front of the broken wooden shards that had once been the door to Thrall's cell. His worst fear had been proven right.
Damn them all to hell, he cried. Someone stole my orc. Thomas, I want men, I want horses, I want flying machines. I want Thrall back immediately.
Thrall was surprised at how deeply he slept and how lively his dreams were. He woke as night was falling and for a moment simply lay where he was. He felt the soft grass beneath his body, enjoyed the breeze that caressed his face. This was freedom, and it was sweet indeed. Precious. He now understood why some would rather die than live imprisoned. A spear prodded his neck, and the faces of 6 human males peered down on him.
You,
one of them said.
Get up.
Thrall cursed himself as he was dragged behind a horse with 2 men walking guard on either side. How could he have been so foolish? He had wanted to see the encampments, yes, but from the safety of hiding. He wanted to be an observer, not a participant in this system about which he had heard nothing good. He tried to run, but 4 of them had horses and had run him down almost immediately. They had nets, spears, and swords, and Thrall was ashamed at how quickly and efficiently they managed to render him harmless. He thought about struggling, but decided not to. He was under no illusions that these men would pay for a healing if he were injured, and he wanted to keep his strength up. Also, would there be a better way to meet orcs than to be at the camp with them? Certainly, given their fierce warrior's nature, they would be eager to escape. He had knowledge that could help them. So he pretended to be overcome, although he could have taken on all of them at once. He regretted his decision almost immediately when the men began to rummage through his sack.
Plenty of food here, said one. Good stuff, too. We'll eat well tonight, lads. It's Major Remka who'll be eating well, said another. Not if she don't know about it, and we aren't going to tell her, said a third, as Thrall watched the one who had spoken first bit eagerly into one of the small meat pies Taratha had packed. Well, look here, said the second one. A knife. He rose and went to Thrall, who was helplessly bound in a trap net. Stole all this, didn't you? He thrust the knife at Thrall's face. Thrall didn't even blink. Come off it, Holt, said the second man, who was the smallest and most anxious of the 6. The others had tied their horses to nearby branches and were busy divvying up the spoils, putting them in their saddlebags and not choosing to report it to the mysterious Major Remka, whoever he was. I think they said it was a her. Also, it's kind of weird that the second one sort of responded to himself. I think that must be an oversight. I'm keeping this one, said Holt. You can have the food, but everything else we find we really have to report, said the second man, looking nervous about standing up to Holt, but doggedly determined to follow orders. And what if I don't, said Holt. Thrall did not like him. He looked mean and angry like Blackmore. What are you going to do about it? It's what I'm going to do about it that ought to concern you, Holt. Oh, it's what I'm going to do about it that ought to concern you, Holt, said a new voice. This man was tall and slender. He did not look physically imposing, but Thrall had fought enough fine warriors to know that often technique was as good as and sometimes better than size. Judging by Holt's reactions, this man was respected. The rules exist so that we can keep an eye on the orcs. This is the first one we've seen in years that's carried a human weapon. It's worth reporting. As for these... Thrall watched in horror as the man began to leaf through Taratha's letters. Blue eyes narrowing, the tall man turned to look at Thrall. Don't suppose you can read, can you? The other men erupted with laughter, crumbs sprang from their mouths, but the man asking the question appeared to be serious. Thrall started to answer, then thought better of it. Better to pretend not to even know the human language, he thought. The tall man strode up to him. Thrall tensed, anticipating him below, but instead the man squatted down beside him and stared directly into Thrall's eyes. Thrall looked away. You! Read! The man pointed with a gloved finger to the letters. Thrall stared at them and, figuring even an orc who didn't speak the human tongue would have made the connection, shook his head violently. The man gazed at him a moment more, then rose. Thrall wasn't sure he'd convinced him. He looks familiar somehow, said the man. Thrall went cold inside. They all look the same to me, said Holt. Big, green, and ugly. Too bad none of us can read, said the man. I bet these papers would tell us a lot. You're always dreaming above your station, Warwick, said Holt, a hint of contempt in his voice. Warwick shoved the letters back into the sack, plucked the knife from Holt's grasp over the man's half-hearted protest, and slung the now mostly empty sack over his horse's withers. Put the food away before I change my mind. Let's take him to the camp. Thrall had assumed they would put him on a cart or perhaps in one of the wagons he remembered from so long ago. He was not granted even that basest of courtesies. They simply attached a rope to the trap net that bound his limbs so tightly and dragged him behind one of their horses. Thrall, however, had an extremely high pain threshold after so many years in the gladiator ring. What hurt him more deeply was the loss of Taratha's letters. It was fortunate that none of these men could read. He was grateful they had not found the necklace. He had been holding the necklace she'd given him last night and had managed to slip it inside his black trousers before it was noticed. That part of her, at least, he could still hold on to. There's some more of that foreshadowing. He's going to use it. The journey seemed to take forever, but the sun crawled across the sky only slowly. Finally, they reached a large stone wall. Warwick called for admittance, and Thrall heard what sounded like heavy gates opening. He was being dragged on his back, so he had an excellent view of the thickness of the wall as they entered. Disinterested guards threw the newcomer a brief glance, then went about their business. The first thing that struck Thrall was the stench. It reminded him of the stables at Durnhold, but was much stronger. He wrinkled his nose. Holt was watching it, and he laughed.
Been away from your own kind too long, eh, Greenie? He sneered. Forgotten how bad you smell?
He pinched his nose shut and rolled his eyes. Halt, said Warwick, a warning in his voice. He grasped the net's webbing and spoke a word of command. At once Thrall felt his bonds loosen and he got to his feet. He stared about in horror. Huddled everywhere were dozens, perhaps hundreds of orcs. Some sat in puddles of their own filth, their eyes unfocused, their sharp-toothed jaws slack. Others paced back and forth, muttering incoherently. Some slept tightly curled up on the earth, seeming not to even care if they were stepped on. There was an occasional squabble, but even that apparently sapped too much energy, for it died down almost as quickly as it had begun. What was going on here? Were these men drugging Thrall's people? Well, that had to be the answer. He knew what orcs were, how fierce, how savage. He had expected. Well, he had not known what to expect, but certainly not this peculiar, unnatural lethargy. Go on, said Warwick, shoving Thrall gently toward the nearest cluster of orcs. Food's put out once a day. There's water in the troughs. Thrall stood up straight and tried to put a bold face on it as he strode to a group of 5 orcs sitting beside the aforementioned water troughs. He could feel Warwick's eyes boring into his scraped and bruised back and heard the man say, I could swear I've seen him somewhere before. Then he heard the men walking away. Only one of the orcs looked up as Thrall approached. His heart was racing. He had never been this close to one of his people before, and now here were 5 of them. I greet you, he said in Orcish. They stared at him. One of them looked down and resumed clawing at a small rock embedded in the dirt. Thrall tried again. I greet you, he said, spreading his arms in the gesture that the books told him indicated one warrior saluting another.
Where'd they catch you?
One of them finally asked, speaking the human language. At Thrall's startled look, she said,
You weren't raised to speak Orcish, I can tell. You're right. I was raised by humans. They taught me only a little Orcish. I was hoping you could help me learn more.
The orcs looked at one another, then broke into laughter.
Raised by humans, eh? Hey, Krakus, come over here. We got ourselves a good storyteller. All right, shaman, tell us another one.
Thrall felt this chance to connect with these people slipping through his fingers.
Please, I mean no insult. I'm a prisoner like you are now. I've never met any orcs. I just want...
Now the one who had looked away turned around and Thrall fell silent. This orc's eyes were bright red and seemed to glow as if lit from within.
So, you want to meet your people? Well, you've met us. Now leave us be.
He turned back to picking at the stone.
Your eyes,
Thrall murmured, too stunned by the strange red glow to recognize the insult. The orc cringed, lifted a hand to shield his face from Thrall's gaze, and hunched away even farther. Thrall turned to ask a question and found himself standing alone. The other orcs had all shuffled away, casting furtive glances back at him. The sky had been clouding over all day, and it had steadily been growing colder. Now, as Thrall stood alone in the center of a courtyard surrounded by what remained of his people, the gray skies opened and icy rain mixed with snow began to fall. Thrall barely noticed the wretched weather, so deep was his personal misery. Was this why he had severed every tie he had ever known? To live out his life as a captive in a group of spiritless, sluggish creatures whom he once dreamed of leading against the tyranny of the humans? Which was worse, he mused, fighting in the ring for the glory of Blackmoor, sleeping safe and dry, reading letters from Tari, or standing here, alone, shunned even by those of his own blood, his feet sinking into freezing mud?
The answer came swiftly. Both were intolerable. Without appearing too obvious, Thrall began to look about with an eye toward escape. It should be simple enough. Only a few guards here and there, and at night they would have more difficulty seeing than Thrall would. They looked bored and disinterested, and judging by the lack of spirit, even energy or interest, displayed by this pathetic collection of orcs, Thrall did not even think one of them would have the courage to try to climb the rather low walls. He felt the rain now as it soaked the trousers he wore. A gray, gloomy day for a gray, gloomy lesson. The orcs were no noble, fierce warriors. He could not imagine how these creatures ever gave the humans the slightest bit of resistance.
We were not always as you see us here,
Came a soft, deep voice at his elbows. Surprised, Thrall turned around to see the red-eyed orc staring up at him with those unsettling orbs.
soulless, afraid, ashamed. This is what they did to us,
He continued, pointing to his eyes.
and if we could be rid of it, our hearts and spirits might return.
Thrall sank down in the mud beside him.
Go on,
He urged.
I'm listening.
I wonder if that's Orgrim. But no, because, maybe. But I don't think so. All right, we got another episode in the pipe, 5x5. I'm guessing this next third is going to be Thrall getting to the point where he has rallied enough people that they can break out and start forming clans. That's what I'm guessing, because I'm guessing the final is going to be what they do to get together and reform as the Horde and decide to strike off for, I think, what ultimately becomes Kalimdor. All right, I thank you everybody so much for watching and listening. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and I'll see everyone next time on Lore of Warcraft.